Hi, my name is James, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make this animated light effect in Framer, sometimes referred to as God rays. The good news is it takes only 4 easy steps to do and uses simple frame elements. Let's get started with step 1, which is create a light source. Here's our setup, and it's pretty simple. We've got the desktop breakpoint with a background fill of black. To create the light source, I'm going to hit Command- to zoom out a little bit, and then hit F and drag out a frame. I'll just resize this, the width and height, so I've got a square, and then I can take this blue grab handle and pull it all the way to the middle to get a circle. Now, your light source doesn't have to be a circle, but I guess something just intuitively says to me that it's a good place to start. My light source is colored white, which is fine for now. Next, all I need to do is position it. Where you position your light source is totally up to you. It can go here, it can go here, it can even go down here. But bear in mind that natural light tends to come from above, and if you're creating God rays, somewhere above the screen is best. I'm going to put mine right here in the center, and then I'm going to rename this frame light source. And that's it. Step 1 complete. Next, we move on to step 2, creating light beams. As promised, we're going to do all of this using only frames. So to create my light beam, I'm going to use a frame. Now, I know what you might be thinking, that doesn't look anything like a light beam, and you'd be very correct to think that. So to help with this, I'm going to go to the fill, select radial gradient, keep the inside as white, and then take the outside and drag that to opacity 0. Beautiful. Next, I'll set the width to something slightly thinner, say 45 pixels, and already it's looking much more beamy. Now to position our beam. If I grab it at the top here and take it to the center of the light source and let go, it nests within the light source, and that's not what I want because now I can't see it on the desktop. So if I take it in the middle and then drag it to the center again and let go, I can see it's going to nest within the desktop because of the blue square around the edge. But when I let go, it drops down, and that's because the desktop defaults to a stack as shown by this little icon, and because of that, the position of the beam is set to relative. Now, I could address this by selecting desktop and then going to the layout properties and hitting minus, and that turns the desktop into a frame, and now I can freely move this beam around. But actually, it's going to serve us better if we create our own frame in the desktop and keep the desktop as a stack like its default, and that will become much clearer later in the next step. Now that I've got my frame, I can take my beam and position it in the middle, and then rename it beam, and then drop it inside this frame, and that's my first beam complete. Of course, I'm going to need more than one beam. So for my next one, I'm going to hit Command-D to duplicate. And then ideally, I'd like to just start rotating this around the light source. But if I do begin rotating, you'll see it rotates around this origin here. And the thing to know is that within the transform section of the properties panel, I actually have the option to adjust the origin. Now, by default, it's set to 50% along the X and 50% along the Y. So starting at the top left, that's 50% along this X and 50% down the Y. Now, I actually want 50% along the X and 0 along the Y. So I change this to 0, and then now I am free to rotate around the light source. Now I'm all set. I can just duplicate beams and position them at an angle I think looks good. I'm going to speed this up just to save time, and note that just because of where my light source is positioned, I want my beams to fan outwards, and I'm going to position them more or less evenly with a bit of randomness to make them seem more natural. With that, we move on to step 3, which is refine and blur. We've got our beams coming down, but it's still some way off the effect we want. To address this, there are a few refinements we can make. We can vary the width of the beams, we can also play with the opacity, and we can vary the blur. And that's where our parent frame comes in. With this parent frame selected, within the styles property, I can go to filter and blur, and then I've got this slider here where I can play with the level of blur. Essentially, this step involves an iterative cycle of playing with the rays and the blur to get the effect we want. And as I whiz through here, you'll also see that I end up copying the light source and layering that in with progressively lower opacities to really get a sense of the glow from above. Awesome, I'm pretty happy with this. It's worth mentioning that you can tinker away forever if you want to, but at some point you've just got to make a call. Does it look more or less as I'd like it to? The two light sources you saw me add within the frame, I actually ended up blurring these as well, just to soften it a bit and make it bind together. That's step 3 complete. Now on to step 4, which is animate. We're going to animate the rays with a loop animation. To do that, I'm just going to first select these light sources and lock them so that I don't keep selecting them. And then I'm going to just randomly select a bunch of the beams, about half of them. And then I'm going to move over to effects and add a loop. And then on the loop, we're going to change the opacity to say 0.7 and the scale to say 0.9. And then we're going to set that to mirror, and we'll adjust the transition time to 2 seconds. So because it's mirroring back and forth, that will be around a 4-second animation. And we need to just take off the rotation because we don't want the beams to spin. Now let's just have a look at that. And you can see that's subtly animating, but it's all a little bit too in sync. So the next step is to go back onto the effects and then start changing the time at which each of them starts. So I can do that by selecting here and then selecting one by one, and I can just adjust the delay. And I'm just going to do this somewhat randomly just to see how it looks. Let's try that. And already that's looking much better. And again, the thing here is an iterative cycle of playing with the animation times and the spacing to get the effect that you really want and the one that you think looks just perfect. I don't think I need my light source anymore, so I can delete that. And if I want to change the color of my beams, I just need to highlight them, and then I can go to the fill, pull it in a little, and then sweep across the hues to find something that I like. And it's as easy as that. Step 4 complete, and you've learned how to create an animated light source. Next up, I have that bonus step. Before that, if you're enjoying this video, please consider hitting the subscribe button. It's the best way to support this content. Okay, that's out of the way. Let's get into bonus step 5, which is adding texture. For this last step, I'm going to use this particles component, which you can find on framer.supply. It's a really great website with components made by Framer team member Benjamin. This particular component is perfect for creating a kind of floating dust effect in our light. It's got plenty of settings, and we're just going to see a few of them here. The ones we need to focus on are backdrop. We remove the backdrop by taking opacity to 0. Color of white is fine. We're going to increase the amount to 200, and then we're going to set the opacity to range between 0 and 1. And we are going to remove the hover effect because we don't want the particles to follow the mouse. Once I've got that, I'm going to go to the styles, add a mask, add a radial mask, and then set it to be a radial mask outwards like so. And then once I've got this, I can drop it into the desktop frame. I'm going to set a position to absolute, and then I'm going to move it up and increase the size. I'm probably going to thin it out a bit there, and something like that. And once we've done that, preview it, and you have this really cool floating dust effect, which adds some additional texture to your lighting. That's it. I hope you enjoyed playing around with this lighting effect. Don't forget there's a remix link in the description below, and whilst you're there, maybe just type me a quick comment about what you think. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for watching, and see you again soon.